So hello, welcome to Lab 1 Intermediate Excel. If you missed the Intermediate Excel lab on Friday, or if you want to refer to it in the future, this will be a tutorial mostly presenting the answers to the exercises and briefly mentioning some of the topics that we discussed in lab. Okay. So what I have pulled up is the spreadsheet that we're working from in the lab. You can find that on Courseworks if you go to Files and Resources, open the Labs folder, and you should be able to select Lab 1 Excel Intermediate, which is what we're working with. So there will be 4 topics that we'll generally cover in this lab, and they are listed on the left side of the Instruction tab. And those topics are managing your data, so staying organized, manipulating cells, from naming them to conditional formatting. We'll briefly look at charts and diagrams, and throughout the lab we'll look at some basic formulas that should be of use to you when you're building budgets this semester. You do have a Tips and Resources tab in the beginning of the spreadsheet as well. So if you have additional questions or want to look up additional formulas, please use those links as a resource. Okay, so we'll get started. Basically, the idea of this lab is to expose you to some of the Excel skills that you'll need to build budgets. Most of them are pretty rudimentary, and most of that will be done just by completing these exercises in the lab. So we'll start with exercise 1. In addition to what to do, it gives us what sheet and which year to manipulate, as well as sometimes what cell or cell range. All right. Before we do 1, just a quick note about managing data. We're going to work with a revenue budget, an expense budget, and a combination of those two, a net income budget. It is going to be really helpful throughout the semester if you sort of carefully think through how you want to format your budgets before you create them and keep them as organized as possible. And so one quick way to note that is within these budgets we've got 10 years, 2001 through 2010, and what we have is a month-by-month breakdown of, on this tab, the revenue for each month, on the expense tab, obviously the expenses for each month, and then eventually we'll have the net income, which is revenue minus expenses. One quick thing to note, it's fairly easy to read and look at. We've got a title at the top, clear column headers, but probably what's most notable is just that if we want to manipulate this data, it's set up in a way that if we want to look, for example, at the January 2001 revenue, that's going to be in cell B6. And we've structured our data in a way that if we want to find the January 2001 expenses, that's also in cell B6. And obviously, the net income is not actually in B6, but it is in row 6 for 2001 January. So structuring your data in that way is going to be really helpful throughout this lab as well as throughout the semester. Okay, step 1. We're going to sum all expenses in euros and dollars, and we're going to do that on the expenses spreadsheet for all years. Okay, go to the expenses. We want to sum euros and dollars for every year from 2001 to 2010. So we'll scroll down to the bottom. Here we go, we have the cells for total. Okay, basically what we're doing here is a really simple, not even really a formula, but just an equation where what we want to do is say equals, and we're just going to reference the subtotal for each year. So we'll start with 2010, and we will use addition signs to add the subtotals for each of the remaining years. Okay, so that's done. We'll hit enter, and that's going to give us our total 2001 to 2010 expenses. All right. Now we also wanted to do this for euros, and we have euros and dollars listed on here because we might be an international nonprofit who has either funders or clients or employees who work both in a country that uses dollar-denominated currency or euro-denominated currency. So we're actually going to display our revenues and our expenses in both units. So what we could do is we could go back down here, and like before, we could put in our little equal sign, and starting with 2010, we could add the subtotals. But as you saw before, that's going to take a little bit of time, and there's a much simpler way to do that. And what we're going to do is we're going to basically grab onto the formula that we just created, which was summing the subtotal for each of the 10 years. And we know in dollars it's in column B. We know in column C is euros. So if we just drag this formula over, Excel is going to do something that's really helpful for us. So we're just clicking and dragging the formula over. And even though it displays 0, which is because all of these are empty at the moment, if we double click and we get the formula, we can see what Excel did is Excel actually took our old formula, which was B 144, 130, 116, and it turned that into C 144, 130, 116. So Excel will intuit sometimes what you want to do, especially when you're trying to copy and paste formulas in new cells. And so long as you have a reference that's open, which means that it's just the column label, which is C, and the row number, Excel can often correctly intuit what you want to do with your equation. So in this case, we just drag the formula over, and it actually has summed all those rows for us without actually having to select them individually. Good, so we're done with step 1. We're not going to do that, that's really slow. So step 2 is fill in the 2009 and 2010 net income in both dollars and euros. Okay, and our hint is that income is equal to revenue minus expenses. We're going to do this on the net income sheet for the years 2009 and 2010. Okay, so we often want to know our net income, and in this case we need to calculate that data for 2009 and 2010. Okay, so probably the most complicated solution to this problem would be say, all right, I need the net income for January 2009, so I need the revenue for January 2009, which is this number, minus the expenses for January 2009. So we'll put that in there. We'll add our little equal sign so Excel knows to treat it like a formula, and there we go. So we have it. But that was a really slow, difficult way to do it, and there's always the chance that we're going to create errors when we copy and paste or type in those things. So we're actually not going to do that. We'll go ahead and delete that. A much better, safer, simpler way is just to reference or link to cells on different sheets. So in this case, we'll just hit our equal sign, and we want revenue minus expenses. So we're going to go to revenue and find January 2009, and we're just going to click on that. And as you can see up here, it's now referencing the revenue spreadsheet cell B118. Right, and we're going to hit minus, and then we're going to go to our expenses spreadsheet, and we're going to find January 2009, and we're going to select that cell. Right, and again, it's referenced the sheet name as well as the cell coordinates. All right, we hit enter, and it's going to take us back to our net income sheet, and it's going to give us the correct net income. Okay. So we've got this. Again, we could do that individually for each of the 12 months in 2009 and 2010, but it's going to be a lot more simple for us to use Excel's features to drag this equation. So last time we dragged it across. Again, this time we can drag it across, and we'll see that before it was referencing columns B. When we dragged it across, it's now referencing columns C, which is exactly what we wanted it to do, since euros are calculated in a different column. Okay. In addition to dragging those equations across, we can also drag them down. when you drag them down, what Excel does is rather than changing the column, it's going to change the row reference. So instead of 118 here, Excel says, well, you want to calculate something one down. I'm assuming you want to adjust your equation and your reference sheets to one row down. Okay, so we can do that here as well. And we get those answers. We don't want to drag all the way down because then we would drag over our subtotal formulas, which are different. But again, we can do this for 2010 to complete task number 2. Okay, good. So we're done with step 2. The last step we'll do is step 3. Fill in the euro column using the exchange rate. And that's going to be on the revenue sheet for year 2001. Okay, so you see we have an empty euro column here. We want to populate that with the correct figures. And what we want to do is we basically want to take the US dollar value times the US dollar euro exchange rate. Okay, and we were thoughtful and we knew that we were going to need to do this, so we actually included that information at the very top of our spreadsheet, and we looked online and we found the correct value at this point in time. Okay, so we put that exchange rate in cell C3. What we want to do is multiply the US dollar amount times the US to euro exchange rate, and that should give us the euro value of that quantity. So the simplest thing to do would just be to select January and then select the exchange rate and hit enter. And that does indeed give us the correct euro value. However, if you were thinking that we could just copy that formula down like last time, you would be wrong, because we're running into a lot of problems, as you can see here. So basically what happened was, even though Excel moved down one row like we wanted it to calculate the February revenue, it also moved our reference to cell C3 down one row to C4, which is an empty cell. And that's throwing off our calculations. So there's two things we can do. All right. The first thing we'll do is we'll delete all of that, and we'll go back here. The first thing we can do is we can anchor our reference to cell C3. And the way we anchor something is by putting dollar symbols in front of it. Okay. And if you want to anchor both the row and the column, you need to put dollar symbols in front of both the column reference and the row reference. So dollar symbol C, dollar symbol 3. Okay. What that's going to do is anytime we move and expand this formula into a new cell, Excel is going to know that we always want to refer back to exactly cell C3. We never want it to move the column over or move the row up or down. Okay. So we hit enter there, and now if we drag this formula down, Excel is going to do exactly what we want it to. In this case, it's going to adjust down to row B8, but it's going to keep our reference to C3 locked to the exchange rate that we enter. Okay. There is one more thing you can do that some people find helpful, which is if we look in this cell, we note it's just a bunch of cell references, and that's not always very intuitive. So what's also possible is instead of saying, well, this is going to be dollar symbol C, dollar symbol 3, and I'm going to lock that reference, you can actually name your reference to this cell. So if we click on this and we go to formulas and we go to name manager, it's going to let us name this cell, and then instead of referring to it as C3, we can just refer to the name itself. Okay, so we'll create a new one, and we'll call it exchange rate, no spaces. It already says it refers to cell C3, and we can see it's locked onto that cell, so we'll say OK. And we'll close this out. And so now what we can do is instead of saying C3, we can just say exchange rate and hit enter. And we can drag that down, and we see it's going to give us the same numbers, but it's going to say B13 times exchange rate instead.